The exciting and thrilling story begins with a little girl shown sitting at home, writing a letter to someone. This little girl is suffering deeply from something, and she can no longer control it. She pours all her feelings into the letter, and it seems like she doesn't want to live anymore. We then see the same little girl stepping out of her house. When her face is revealed, her eyes have turned completely yellow. The truth is, the little girl is a vampire, and she doesn't know what to do in this situation. Very soon, sunlight begins to fall on her body, and she burns up completely. It's obvious that vampires cannot survive in sunlight. But why did such terrible things happen to this little girl? There's a huge secret behind it. The actual truth is that the entire world is slowly turning into vampires. It all began years ago due to the spread of a virus. This virus originated from a bat and was so potent that it started converting normal humans into vampires. In fact, now a large percentage of Earth's population has already turned into vampires. The few humans that remain stay hidden inside shelters. During the day, no one dares go outside, because clearly, vampires cannot withstand sunlight. But when night falls, all the vampires come out of their homes and live their lives normally. Another notable trait of vampires is that to survive, they must drink human blood. The problem now is that the number of humans is rapidly decreasing. If this continues, all the vampires will die of hunger. That's why continuous experiments are being conducted to find a replacement for human blood. Many vampire scientists have been working on this for years. Now, we are introduced to a scientist named Edward, who is seen driving in his car. Edward works at a major pharmaceutical company. He is a researcher who develops different types of medicines and solutions. Edward is also a vampire, but he dislikes harming humans. As he enters the company, we see many humans suspended in tanks, indicating that humans are being farmed here. This entire company is dedicated to extracting and distributing human blood across various locations. But even they know that the supply of human blood is limited. A solution must be found. Edward is shown sitting in a board meeting. The CEO of the company, Charles, is also present, along with other important members who are listening to the speech. Charles explains through the presentation that many experiments have been conducted to find a substitute for human blood. He also highlights a major consequence: if a vampire doesn't receive a proper amount of blood, changes begin to occur in their body. During the research, they found that when a vampire is deprived of blood for several months, their ears become pointy and their body begins transforming into a different kind of creature. These new creatures were named subsiders. If a replacement for human blood isn't found soon, all vampires will eventually turn into these dangerous subsiders. Edward and his colleague Christopher were assigned the task, and they had been working on it for a long time, but without any real success. Edward is very disappointed and even more shocked after hearing these consequences. After the meeting, Charles asks Edward to speak with him privately. When offered blood-infused coffee, Edward refuses to drink it. He doesn't like these things at all. Charles insists that Edward must begin testing, no matter who the subject is. Even if lives are lost in the process, a blood replacement must be found. Edward is now shown sitting in the lab with his partner Christopher. They have created some medicines that might serve as a replacement for human blood, but they can't guarantee it with 100% certainty. Despite everything, Christopher pressures Edward to test the solution on a vampire. That same vampire was now brought into the laboratory, while Charles and the other members watched from the observation area. First, the solution developed by Edward and Christopher was injected into the vampire's body. At first, everything seemed normal as the solution spread through his system. But after a short while, some unusual changes began. The vampire started vomiting uncontrollably, and his body became extremely unstable. To stabilize him, they administered another solution intended to neutralize the effects of the first one. It looked like the vampire might return to normal. But just moments later, his entire body exploded, which meant that the experiment was a complete failure. The solution didn't work at all. Poor Edward was once again left disappointed. Finishing his work for the day, Edward began driving back home. Suddenly, he noticed something in the rearview mirror. His ears had grown sharp and pointed. Strange changes were occurring in his own body, and they seemed very weird to him. Because of this distraction, Edward lost focus and almost collided with another car. At the very last moment, he swerved to avoid the crash. He barely saved himself, but the other car was damaged and stalled. Since it was Edward's fault, he got out to check if the people in the other car were all right. As he approached the car, a woman suddenly fired at him with a crossbow, hitting him in the arm. Luckily, Edward was a vampire, and with some blood, he could heal the wound. It turned out that the woman's name was Audrey, and inside the car were her family members. They were all humans, escaping and trying to survive. Edward quickly realized the situation. He also heard vampire police officers nearby. If they found out these people were human, they would capture them. Given that humans were already in short supply on Earth, Edward, who never wanted to hurt humans, told Audrey and her group to get inside his car quickly. He activated all the stealth features and blacked out the windows, making it undetectable. When the vampire police arrived, Edward misled them, saying the humans had run off in another direction and had crashed into his car. The officers believed him and went off to search elsewhere. Once the danger had passed, Audrey and her family got out of the car, but they were still terrified of Edward, unsure whether he could be trusted. To them, he was still just another vampire. Soon, Audrey and her group left, heading toward a safe location. When Edward returned home, public announcements began blaring, warning everyone to hide indoors because sunrise was approaching. Any vampire caught outside would burn alive. Tired from a long day, Edward tried to rest. But suddenly, someone entered. It was his brother, Frankie, who had returned after many years of serving in the military forces. These forces were tasked with finding humans and using them for various purposes. Edward wasn't exactly happy to see Frankie, as the two brothers didn't get along well. Frankie had only come to celebrate his birthday. He wasn't serious about anything, just liked wasting time. As a gift for Edward, Frankie brought something he thought was amazing, 100% pure human blood, an extremely rare find. He poured a glass for himself and one for Edward. But Edward refused immediately. He didn't consume human blood. He didn't believe in hurting humans. Frankie couldn't understand Edward's mindset. Edward explained that he worked for a company that experimented on humans just to find a substitute for blood, and even though he was part of it, he hated the idea of harming them. This contradiction, a vampire who doesn't drink blood and works in a blood research company, was very strange indeed. But Edward clearly said that this was his job. No matter what he had to do for it, he would never hurt humans. Edward immediately started to throw away the blood bottle, but Dalton stopped him and, in anger, smashed the bottle against the wall himself. Tension flared between the two brothers. Dalton was about to leave when suddenly, a subsider appeared in front of him. This was the terrifying creature that a vampire turns into when they don't get blood, an evolved and dangerous stage. The subsider immediately ran to the spilled blood on the floor and started licking it, even licking the wall. Edward was terrified. Dalton pulled out a knife and moved into attack, but obviously, subsiders are extremely dangerous. The subsider swung once, sending Dalton flying backward. He fell unconscious on the spot. Now it was Edward's turn. Terrified, he backed away into a corner while the subsider prepared to attack him. Just then, Dalton regained consciousness, picked up the knife, and tried to fight back. This subsider had many powers and now started climbing the wall to strike from above. Dalton and Edward worked together to fight it, one distracting it, the other attacking. Somehow, they managed to kill the subsider, but their house was now in chaos. Soon after, vampire police officers were called in for investigation. From what they found, it was concluded that the creature had been a gardener who turned into a subsider due to the lack of blood. One officer noticed some unusual marks on the subsider's neck. Their origin was unknown, so further research was needed. Edward and Dalton, who had been fighting just moments ago, now stood together, terrified. After the investigation was over and the officers left, Edward heard more noises. When he went to check the door, he found Audrey standing there, the same woman who had once pointed a gun at him. Audrey simply asked Edward to hear her out. Her team was looking for vampires they could trust, and she believed Edward was one of them. She then told him that while he had been working on a replacement for human blood, she had a better plan, but needed Edward's help. She gave him a map with a location marked on it and told him to come there the next day. Saying this, Audrey left. When Edward came back inside, his brother Frankie was waiting and asked who that woman was. Edward didn't want to talk about it and brushed the question off. But Frankie clearly grew suspicious. It was obvious he might interfere later. The next day, a new consignment of human blood arrived at Edward's company. They were now increasing production on a large scale, meaning even the remaining humans would be wiped out. Edward knew this. His boss Charles came to him and said that this had to be done. If they couldn't create a substitute for human blood, they would have to kill the remaining humans. There were no other options for the vampires. Due to the shortage of blood, the company had begun selling the remaining stock at massive prices. Poor Edward, none of his experiments were succeeding. Then suddenly, he remembered the map Audrey gave him. So he turned off the tracking system in his car and set off, following the map. Because it was daylight, he took a special car that was fully shielded in darkness. Audrey was already waiting for him. She told him to park under a tree so that there would be heavy shade and no sunlight. Edward complied, wearing dark sunglasses and a hood, and stepped out to talk. Just then, a man named Leo appeared in front of him and immediately pointed at Edward, saying, I'm a human. But I used to be a vampire once, said Leo. Edward thought they were playing a joke on him. That couldn't possibly be true. But Audrey explained that this was all real. She had seen it with her own eyes. Leo had once been a vampire, but after a strange incident, he transformed back into a human. Edward was stunned. If such a thing was truly possible, it could be a miracle. He had been researching for so long, but had never seen anything like this. Just as he was trying to process it, his brother Frankie showed up. Frankie had been secretly following Edward for a while and was already suspicious. He had even called in military reinforcements. Holding everyone at gunpoint, he ordered Audrey and Leo to step aside. But Audrey quickly shoved him into the sunlight, causing him to start burning immediately. However, by then, more military officers had arrived. Audrey and Leo jumped into Edward's car and began to drive away. The military started firing relentlessly, and Leo's car was severely damaged in the process. Now, they had to escape at any cost, because if the military caught them, they'd be treated brutally. Due to the gunfire, multiple bullets had pierced the car, allowing sunlight to leak inside. Edward's body started to burn wherever the rays hit. Audrey tried to shield him with her hands, but there were too many holes. Leo quickly took control of the vehicle while Edward hid in the back seat. Using his skills, Leo maneuvered the car toward a narrow path that led to a broken bridge. Somehow, he managed to cross it and reach the other side. When a military jeep tried to follow, it crashed and was destroyed. The other officers stopped their pursuit at the edge, realizing they couldn't follow. Leo eventually got the car to a safe, shaded area with minimal sunlight. There, he revealed the full truth to Edward. This incident had occurred years ago, when Leo himself was still a vampire. He had recently purchased a special car that allowed him to see only through cameras, ideal for vampires, who are extremely sensitive to light and cannot drive during the day. One day, while driving, Leo got distracted and accidentally drove straight into a body of water. For a brief moment, he came into direct contact with sunlight, but the water somehow neutralized the effects. After a while, when he climbed out, he was unaffected by the light. Looking at himself, he realized he had transformed back into a human. Something unusual had happened during the incident, something that turned a vampire back into a human. He had come to Edward to discover what that was. Edward, deeply intrigued, now decided to join Audrey and Leo in this mission. He was ready to help uncover the truth. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the large corporation, Charles, Edward's boss, was seen looking at a photo of his daughter. His daughter wasn't a vampire, she was a human, and to keep her safe from other vampires, he had to send her away. Just then, Frankie arrived and informed Charles about Edward and the humans he was helping. Charles was very pleased with Frankie for his loyalty to both the company and the government. Charles told him to relay a message to Edward. If your brother wants to return, let him. We won't harm him. But the remaining humans must be captured, no matter what. Frankie understood the assignment and agreed to continue assisting. We now see Edward traveling far away with Audrey and Leo. They arrived at a hidden settlement, where other humans were believed to be living. There, they met a man named Jarvis. Jarvis ran a community dedicated to protecting surviving humans. His mission was to gather as many survivors as possible and offer them shelter and safety. After all, this was the only way to ensure the survival of the human species. We learn that along the way, Edward had to drink Audrey's blood. If he didn't consume some blood, he would transform into a subsider, a feral, uncontrollable creature, and that would be extremely dangerous for the humans. So, the best thing was to never let Edward go thirsty. When they reached the hiding area, there was a vampire named Turner waiting there. Despite being a vampire, Turner fought to protect humans. He still had feelings for humanity and was determined to bridge the gap between vampires and humans. Edward joined them and began his research work alongside them. Back at Charles's company, many of the machines and artificial humans he'd created were failing. The company was suffering massive losses, and they were unable to complete their assignments on time. This made Charles deeply anxious and frustrated. Later that night, we're shown a coffee shop at a vampire station. Due to very low amounts of blood mixed in the coffee, some vampire customers grew furious. They even began attacking the employees working there. The situation turned into complete chaos. Police officers quickly arrived and used their special equipment to sedate the angry vampires. Even within vampire society, things were getting worse. Meanwhile, Edward collected a blood sample from Leo, intending to examine the structure of his blood cells. While doing so, he also asked Leo how he felt during the transformation. Leo explained everything in detail. Upon analysis, Edward discovered that Leo still had vampire cells in his bloodstream, but they were now less than 1%. That meant something in that incident had reversed his vampirism. Edward now knew he had to recreate the exact same conditions that cured Leo. After finishing his work, when Edward stepped outside, everyone began to back away from him. It was obvious Edward was a vampire, and humans would naturally fear him. But Audrey reassured him that if they could close the gap between the two races, there'd be no need for this fear. Humans and vampires could live peacefully together. While they were talking, Edward suddenly noticed a large container nearby. Upon investigating it, he realized it was the perfect spot for an experiment. It had openings for sunlight and enough space to conduct controlled reactions. Under Edward's instructions, the team got to work and began modifying the container. They wanted to start the transformation experiment as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Jarvis was heading out with a small group of people late at night when suddenly, Frankie and his military soldiers ambushed them. Even though Jarvis had turned on bright lights everywhere, the soldiers opened fire and slaughtered many of the humans. Among them was Charles's daughter, who fell unconscious. Thankfully, before passing out, she managed to send a warning message via radio, alerting everyone back at the hiding area. The people there immediately began preparing to evacuate. But Edward told Leo and Audrey that this could be their last chance to complete the experiment. So the three of them stayed behind to finish what they'd started. Inside the container, they began the process. A specific amount of sunlight was directed at Edward. Then he was rapidly cooled, just like what had happened to Leo. This cycle of light and extreme cold was repeated multiple times. At first, it showed no result. But after several attempts, something began to happen. Edward was fully transformed into a human. But before they could celebrate, they realized that a large number of soldiers had already arrived outside, ready to kill them. Leo and Audrey quickly took Edward to a safe hiding spot, where they'd have to wait until the soldiers left. Meanwhile, Charles's unconscious daughter was brought to him. Without hesitation, Charles turned her into a vampire. He wanted her to stay with him forever, even if it meant robbing her of her humanity. Once the military left, Edward and his companions came out of hiding. For the first time ever, Edward felt the warmth of the sun, as a human. He then visited a group of peaceful vampires, hoping they could help. But even they were extremely afraid. After all, military forces were now hunting down all vampires, especially those who, in the absence of blood, were turning into violent subsiders. They were being completely burned by exposing them to sunlight. Maybe the coming generations will now be completely safe. And our story ends right here.